So, welcome again to our Powering Podium session. And I'd like to start by gratefully and respectfully acknowledging that our workplace here at CSI Pacific exists on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Lil'wat, Esquimalt and Songhees nations of the Coast Salish peoples. And I recognise that we're not all in the same place today, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Sydney, BC, which is located within the traditional territory of the Saanich people.
Oh.
So, just very quickly about Powering Podiums. It's a partnership between CSI Pacific and Via Sport. And our focus today is going to be around sharing best practices from BC coaches, and then some comments and thoughts from coaching researchers who are leaders within their field. We'll follow a similar format as last week, where we'll have those short presentations of around 15 minutes, breakout rooms for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and speak around those discussions for around 15 minutes. We did a reasonably good job last week of keeping on track. So my main focus today will be making sure that we finish at 1:30. So just a couple of things before we move on. Just a quick recap from last week. I'll do some introductions and then we'll get moving. So in terms of last week's sessions, the video is now available through CSI Pacific's website, and I sent a link out there yesterday for people to maybe take a look at that. And I've got a few requests as we get towards the end of this to collect feedback from the two sessions that we've done. And I think we had a high level of engagement and discussion around the topics that we had. And as I was working with Noah Wheelock, our comms person, our comms manager, to do some editing, I came up with a few things that I maybe wanted to share. And I found that as I was thinking about these things, I felt that I was almost quoting Donald Rumsfeld. So I'm going to quote Donald Rumsfeld on feedback in coaching. What I took away from last week is that there are some known knowns in terms of delivering feedback and collecting feedback, and they're things that we know. I also felt that there were some known unknowns. There's a lot of things we know, and there are some things that we don't know, but we know that we don't know them. Now this is starting to get a little bit confusing, so let me try to wrap this up for you. But there's also some unknown unknowns, and these are things that we don't know, that we just don't know. And it sort of struck me as we worked through last week that there's a lot of unknown unknowns in terms of feedback. And I feel as coaches that we really need to start to become comfortable with this. And recognize that we need to keep looking at different ways to derive and deliver feedback, because there are so many unknowns. So that was just kind of my takeaway from last week, and I hope to, over the course of the next week or two, maybe ask you to share some of your takeaways with me by email, and I'm going to collate those and develop something to put those onto our website there. So what I'd like to do is maybe we'll now move forward, and we're going to hear now from Dean Merton, who's the UBC women's rugby coach, and Dean's also a grad of the ACD. So Dean, if I can turn over to you, and we can make a start.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. All good. First of all, thanks very much, Andrew, for having me on. As Andrew said, I am a rugby coach. That's my main primary job. I'm not into research or anything. I'm just a good old rugby coach. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of the technology that we are using at UBC at the moment, and it has evolved over a couple of years, and certainly I'm keen to hear people's views on it as well. So what we're going to look at today is the video technology that we use, and that's as a team and individuals. And we're also going to look at some GPS systems that we use, again, how we use this as a team and in an individual environment. So I might sound like a bit of a salesperson at some point. Please excuse me if I do. One of the systems that we use is the VEO camera, and as you can see on the left-hand side there, and some of you may be aware of this, a very good system. Obviously gives you a lot of height and elevation to be able to look down on the field. One of the things about the VEO camera, it's in the middle of the field, and you can see the two eyes on the camera, and that does all the tracking for you. In rugby, we also like to see the rear end of the player, so we can see the running line. So we use the HiPod system. And then we also use, in the bottom right-hand corner, two cameras that I have mounted side by side, which allows me to get a ground view wide and also a tight view, so I can actually see what's going on in certain areas of the game, most of it around the contact point, which is very important for us to be able to see. Sorry, something's just popped up there. As an individual, we use a system called Tag and View, which is used in conjunction with an iPad. We also use some software called Clip Draw, which allows us to just go into a little bit more detail and actually, do some drawing on the screen before we send it on to players to review. In the bottom left-hand corner there, we use a camera called Atomus. This would be used to film something, go back and review it, make some corrections to training, and then go back in and just keep going through that process to make sure that we're seeing development in training. We don't use this all the time because it's a lot of hours and a lot of work, but we would use it on some really technical components, and that being for us, so scrum and line out, there's a lot of technical components that need to happen there, so we'd use it for that. And then in the bottom right hand corner there, you can see the good old chest camera with the GoPro on it, and we also connect the two microphones that we've got to some of our camera systems. And what we use the GoPro for most of the time is to put it on our tactical decision makers, and then we'll connect them to the audio system as well, so we can actually track. We can sit down with them afterwards and say, hey, did you see the space? What was the cues you're looking for? Did we get the ball to the right place? And actually be able to listen to them to see if they're communicating what they're seeing. So them two work in conjunction. The GPS systems that we use on the left, this is what the players would receive immediately after training, or as soon as I get them uploaded. Just gives them some data, not a huge amount, but it gives them enough data to be able to recognize what they did in training. And on the right hand side, you'll see a little bit more data that I send out to them once I get onto the platform, and that's a PDF document. And again, there's a lot of data there, and the key thing for me is we really look at what's important to us. I'm not a specialist in strength and conditioning, but there are things as a rugby coach that I know what I'm looking for to be able to get our athletes performing to a higher standard. This is something, and again, I know you can't see a lot of this, but I'm quite lucky. I have a bunch of fantastic students who then compile all this into a monthly document for me. And what this document allows me to do is share it with the athletes every month. And they can actually then do some comparisons around, what's somebody else in my position doing? Am I on track where I should be? Do I need to, just little things about how they can compare to others. And this is pretty good because it actually does get a lot of dialogue going. And it also allows them to look at it. They can filter it in any way they want. And we can actually build a little bit of data up around. For example, we tend to find that when we're coming to exams, periods of stress on the student athletes, we might just taper back training because we know if we go hard, then we're probably not going to get the best quality out of training. So we just started that this year, and I'll be able to get more data as time goes on. I guess the question is, how does all this work, and you know, how do we put it all together? So pre-session, what I do is I share the practice plan with the athletes, so they know what they're going to do before they go onto the field. So that then allows them to set practice goals, you know, technical, tactical, physical, some mental goals that they might have. And it really puts them, we think, or I think, and I could be wrong, in a good position to be successful prior to arriving at training. And we put quite a lot of detail into that practice plan. It could mean videos of some maybe new drills or activities that we're going to do. In the session, as I said, we film the entire session with the video camera, and we film the entire session with the side-by-side cameras. For multiple individuals, we film them, every involvement they have within the session on the iPad, and we normally pick about 5 or 6 athletes, and we let them know in advance that, hey, you're going to be the girls that we're going to film. And we just have somebody doing that, so that as soon as the session's finished, I can come home, upload it, do some work on it, and then they get it. And as I said, in the sessions, we excuse me, we give the tactical decision makers the chest cameras to wear. So after the session, how does this look? Well, all the girls can go onto the video platform and they can create highlights. So the entire team is actually developing from this system. And don't get me wrong, there are some girls that would spend a lot of time creating highlights, which are then communicated with the coaches, and we get some good dialogue going. There may be others that they only do 1 or 2 clips, and that's okay, because you know, we are obviously in an academic environment, and schools first. If we're in a professional environment, then I would expect everybody to sort of buy into it. The selected individuals, we review the involvements that they've had during the session. So we make some drawings and on the clip draw program, and send that to them. And then what we do, once they've got that, we do a review with them 5 or 6 individuals, whatever it may look like. Again, that review is, you know, it's short and sweet. We don't expect a written review. The way that we do it is, hey, you know, here's your video, give me some feedback, and we'll just have some discussions around some of the things that we're both seeing just through WhatsApp. The individuals obviously get their data from the GPSs on the phone. Again, that's just like, you know, what's some of the key things that we're looking at in the session. Was it an heavy contact session? Are you getting enough collisions in? High speed running? Did you get in, you know, lots of distance? Did you get in high speed meters? What does all that look like? And then obviously I share the team data with them, and we do a little bit of a review around that. As I said, I'm not an expert in strength and conditioning, but I tend to know when people are maybe not doing the things that we expect them to do. And we do only focus on 2 or 3 key areas. We don't overload them with information. How does this all help us? Well, what's really good about all this is that we get coach-athlete engagement right from the get-go. So as soon as they know what the session's like, you know, they're onto it. Okay, let's connect coaches. We really build a good relationship way before the session started, and it helps the coach work with our athletes. As soon as they hit the field, we're all on the same page. We know what we're looking for, and I think it's really good for that engagement. In the session, what's really interesting as well is because we've had this connection pre-session, while the session's going on, there's a lot of focus on interventions with the athletes that's been filmed up. Of course, there's interventions going on with others as well, but because the coaches have a real good feel for what that athlete is looking to do in the session, there's good opportunity to have interventions. And I think one of the things for me is we always think we're doing good interventions, but are we really? I sometimes think that we're not, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Again, just continuing, how does it all help us? Well, you know, athletes are learning all the time because they can go back, they can analyze the session, they can just analyze what they've done, and it really helps them to develop. I have some girls that, you know, I have to tell them that's enough. You've been on here too long because I can track the hours, and you need to get your head into the school work. And then I have other girls that might just do 10 minutes. But we do get real good buy-in for it. Again, post-session, there's a lot of coach-athlete feedback. And I've just put down here, you know, one of the things that we might talk about when it comes to the GPS, you know, are they covering too much ground? Are they not covering enough ground? And then it allows us to look at it and say, well, maybe it's the lack of understanding why they're not covering the ground. It might be nothing to do with their physical preparation. If they're covering too much ground, why? Are they just trying to chase everything and not doing the job that they're supposed to do? So just having this data allows us to really dig a little bit deeper into things. Again, just continuing post-session, we look a lot about the high-speed meters. We want to be a team that gets our high-speed meters up. If they're not doing that, again, for me, it's like, why? Why are you not doing this? Are you just plodding around the field thinking that you're working? You're not anticipating what's happening next? Is it a lack of confidence? But the big one for me that we are always able to do now with using this technology is it a lack of skills? And if it's a lack of skills, let's then go back and look at some of the video footage. So when we put the GPS systems and the video systems together and combined it, it's a really powerful tool. And again, you know, just continuing with the theme of the GPSs, the GPS systems allows me to measure the collisions. So are they making enough collisions? Are they putting enough? You know, we set a scale 0 to 5, and if they're not making that 3 that I set it at, why are they not making that? Is it because they don't understand the role? Is it because they're not technically good at what we're asking them to do? And again, we can always refer back to video footage. And just the last thing to finish off with, I think all this technology is good, and you know, I get excited by it, but are we using it to make sure that we're actually replicating the game? So I'm able to look at GPS stats from games, and does my training reflect what the game looks like? The two slides that you got, sorry, the two images that you can see on the left-hand side, what they are is we track everything that we do in training. Because, you know, I might have a scrum coach who wants to spend 65 minutes on scrummaging. Well, I'm not going to allow that to happen because we only scrum for 3 or 4 minutes in a game. So this is really where I measure, what are we doing in training? Are we doing the right things? And then the one on the right is basically, again, it's just tracking a little bit more. Is the ball in play enough? Is it in play too much? The interventions is absolutely crucial, as I mentioned earlier on. What type of interventions are we doing? Is it everybody? Is it individuals? Is it small parts? And then the final piece that I want to know as well, what does a session look like as far as my warm-up, my technical, tactical? Is it games-based? Is it individual practice? And when I put everything together, I think we have a pretty good, enough information to be able to tell me that, yeah, we're doing the right things. We're in a good place. And, you know, it's a confirmation for me, but also for the coaches, but more importantly for the players. So that's what it's about for us. That's the things that we use. And I am going to put up any questions, but I think we're going to save the questions till later if anybody does have any. So that's it from me. I think it's time to hand over to Ed.
Dean, thanks for that. That was great, and I will ask if we can keep questions until later. Just to want to apologise to Dean for not giving him the introduction that I was hoping to. So Dean, I'm sure that's not, knowing you as I know you, I'm sure that's not upset your feelings. What I will say about Dean, like myself, he's a fellow proud Yorkshireman, and I think, Dean, that's probably enough for most people.
That's good
So
enough.
thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Edward Coghlan from Munster Technological University. He's the research lead in skill acquisition at MTU, if I can call it MTU, Ed. He's lecturer in applied sports psychology and coaching science, and is also the founding member of Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland. He's also a regular guest on podcasts, TV and radio, and he's recognised as an expert in skill acquisition. So, Ed, thank you for making the time for us all the way from Ireland, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to everyone for coming along. It's a really it's the middle of the evening over here in Ireland. And it's lovely just to kind of see some familiar faces like Nikki, and see some new faces, but also see some familiar names. Kind of chuffed, to be honest, to be on a call with Diane Stee-Maurice. I've read pretty much everything that you've ever done, and I love it. So it's pretty cool for me to be on a call with you, and also to see my virtual friend Harjeev Singh on here, who's just, if I may, send out a congrats to him for his new job with the Orlando Magic. So pretty cool to see some familiar names as well. I'm going to kick off, if I may. The title of my presentation is Deliberate Practice Principles for Designing Effective Practice. Okay, so what to expect. We're going to do a quick little history of deliberate practice, a definition of deliberate practice, why should you do it, who does it, an application of what it looks like, and also the resources to help you beyond today. Let me start my watch and away we go. So the history of deliberate practice, it starts and pretty much finishes with this man here on the left, Carl Anders Ericsson from Florida State University. At the top of the page there, you'll see his seminal work with his colleagues in 1993, and that started our conversation, our understanding of what deliberate practice is. It's still to this day his most recent paper at the bottom in 2020. And unfortunately, we lost him to illness last year, which is a great loss, but he was an exceptional man. In the middle are a handful of the books that he wrote and contributed to, and also in there could be over 400 papers around deliberate practice. But one of the outstanding things that he did in this domain was he was always open to engagement, and his commentaries and his rebuttals to people who challenged his work, which he welcomed, were always done in an incredibly and highly respectful way, which I think he increased and elevated our domain to a better place, and we will miss him. Definition of deliberate practice: it is designed as an activity that is highly relevant to improving performance. It is effortful, challenging, not inherently enjoyable, not immediately rewarding, and is underpinned by advanced cognitive processing. So there's a lot that's required for deliberate practice to be in existence in your training sessions. And it's something that when all of these factors come together, it's a very powerful place to be practicing. And it's not to say that other forms of practice aren't effective, but as a definition, it's pretty unforgiving in one sense. Why and who of deliberate practice? So why engage in deliberate practice? Well, it's to improve a rate limiting factor of performance. It has been consistently shown to be an exceptional way to develop expertise in a domain. It is not easy, as the definition shows. It's not inherently enjoyable. It's not immediately rewarding. And it requires effort, a huge amount of motivation, so on and so forth. So that begs the question, who engages in deliberate practice? Well, motivated, resilient, patient, impatient, aspiring individuals. And that patient, impatient aspect is a place where I spend a lot of my time. Yes, I'm a lecturer, but I'm a coach first and foremost. I've been coaching 30 years. This year will be my 30th year coaching. And when I'm relatively new to academia in that regard. And when I finish with academia, I'll still be coaching. And I coach right now. The majority of my work is in professional golf. And I'm constantly dealing with patient, impatient athletes. Athletes who want it now, who have that impatience about them, but they need to be patient also for the process. They need to have that patience to allow things to allow things to develop and progress within themselves. But I also never want to quell that impatient aspect of them because of how it pushes me, and that pushback to me as a coach is critical for me to bring my A game to the party. Also, the why and who, well, it's because it's important. It's because it's such a specific form of practice. There are many other forms of practice and things like maintenance practice, which is fine. It's a top up of sorts of what you do. There's the forever default of naive practice that people do in their performance in a repetitive manner, hoping that repetition alone will lead to improvement. But of course, unless there's strong representative design to what they do, it's highly unlikely that there will be a transfer to the performance space. Play practice space is oftentimes in that fun activity and an engaging activity just to maybe lighten the load and heighten the spirits of the camp. Nothing wrong with that either if it's done at the right time and the right way. Competition practice is maybe a replication of the kind of performance element, but you're working on a lot of things in that space. Deliberate practice is a very focused type of practice, oftentimes done alone, but also with high engagement and feedback loops from a coach, but also a lot of action demonstration and coupling going on as well. Purposive practice is probably the closest thing that we get to deliberate practice, especially if we're working with groups. So in a team setting, field sports and the like, where you might have a shared goal. But shared goals rarely happen when it comes to deliberate practice for athletes. The application of deliberate practice, well, Paul Ford and myself in Nicky and Mark's third edition of the book, we proposed the Aspire model for the application of deliberate practice. And on the left-hand side, the right-hand side of your screen there, you'll see one of the samples that we put forward for the Aspire model, which is, and I took it from one of my own practical situations. The application of the Aspire model to improve the accuracy of a golfer's gap wedge shot from the fairway. So we encourage coaches with their athletes to analyze what's required, find out, identify that rate limiting factor to performance. And that's a difficult task in itself. We're asking people to go through their performance wheel in the way that, and that's why it's in fairness to Andrew and his team, this is a really nice dovetail type session between what myself and Dean are doing, because what Dean just presented there is the means from which we can identify where performance is short. We've got the technology to help us identify that. As Dean even showed there, we've got the technology to tell us, well, what's happening in practice and actually what happens in a game, for us to be able to do that compare and contrast. And then do they align? Does our practice look like, feel like, taste like, smell like the competition space? If it doesn't, we need to ask some very serious questions of what we're doing in practice. And there may be reasons why it doesn't, but if it doesn't, the rationale for those times when it doesn't needs to be very strong. The next part of that is that select mode, to select the aspect of the performance, the technique, the tactics. What are we doing to actually work on this particular aspect of performance? I've done the hard yards now to identify, okay, I might have 3 things I want to work on, but I also want to prioritize these to say, well, which is the largest priority? Which is the biggest block that requires my attention right now? Because that's where I want to spend my time. Because if I do spend my time and invest it properly, I will get better bang for my buck if I go after the big block first, rather than spreading myself too thin. Then you kick into the P space where the practice is there, and that's where the design and running of the sessions is so important. Representative design, a term I've used already, is so critical here. We want the practice to reflect the performance space as best as we can. That's where we move then into the feedback, and we have that engagement with our coaches and ourselves. That's self-directed practice, but also self-directed feedback from reflective practice, engaging with the task that we have athletes doing. Try not to rush in with answers. When we do go in, we go in through an integrative process with questions. We challenge them in the hope that our questions will have them discover the answers through their own processes, rather than us rushing in and providing them with the answers. The repetition space is a critical part then. Repetition without repetition. Okay, that capacity to be able to continually, because again, even in a sport like golf, it's fundamental to golf that professional athletes are adaptable, that they have an inbuilt capacity to be excellent decision makers and problem solvers. We need them then to have a lot of practice of being decision makers and problem solvers in the practice environment. We want them to have that sense of figuring things out, not figuring just the same thing out over and over again, put 10 balls down in the same spot and hit it from there. No. And as it says on the section there, the key for us here is finding the solution from different starting positions on different holes and courses, rather than presenting the same situation repeatedly. How many times do we find ourselves in practice scenarios where we're just doing the same thing over and over again, when a little bit of variability will significantly enhance our adaptability? And we want to have better, more adaptable athletes when they go onto the golf course or the tennis court or wherever, in fact, even in quite defined environments like swimming and the like. A very good friend of mine works with British swimming, Ollie Logan, and he talks about trying to have adaptable athletes. Even though the length of the pool won't change, the lane won't change during the swim, but they're still striving for adaptable athletes so that they're very aware of what's going on. They're tapping into that feedback all the time for what they're doing. And then that final piece is evaluate. That capacity to evaluate your performance, to evaluate the practice environment, but to also realize, and that goes back to that patient-impatient athlete, to realize that learning rarely takes place in the practice environment. We are only, like the evidence would tell us that our real understanding of whether learning is taking place is when we go into that pressure space, when it is in that competitive environment. Well, we can sometimes get a little dizzy with block type environments because we think we're doing better. But of course, what we want to be trying to do is trying to randomize the environment a lot more. It may be a little bit more punishing at times, but in the long run, we would hope that they would see a better transfer to their performance space. And another sample of this, it was presented by Dave Eccles and his colleagues, again, only just last year. And they were looking at the expert's principle of deliberate practice and that application, using established training techniques. And you're going to see some overlap between what Dave and the guys have done and what Paul and I have presented. Established techniques, existing skills as building blocks, okay? Because again, deliberate practice is used, especially in my space, it's used for the development of already expert athletes. It's that I'm dealing with professional athletes for close on nearly 20 years now. They're already skilled. They wouldn't be in talent programs. They wouldn't be representing their country internationally unless they were already skilled. So what we're looking for is that edge to enable them to move to another plateau in their performance. That arrested development that can sometimes hit athletes. What are those ways that we can get in to be able to smoothen out that tricky patch that maybe they feel they're stuck on, okay? Pushing the envelope, again, that capacity to go beyond one's ability. And the challenge point theory speaks a lot to that. Identifying that task within the practice environment that is just outside their reach. If it's too easy, we know that the evidence tells us they can disconnect from it and they can disengage. If it's too far away from them, again, disconnect and disengage. Frustration kicks in. If it's just outside their reach and yet they feel they can get there, that's a very hot space to create in your practice environment. Enhancing mental representations, again, feeds a lot into the work, especially where I am right now with good visualization, positive psychology, being able to see the shot, feel the shot, being able to recall good shots, and yet still being able to be adaptable and being able to absorb what the environment is telling you. Because that day you might be on the same hole, even on the same place on the fairway as yesterday, you're still hitting into a different pin position. Even if it's in the same pin position, which is unlikely, it's a different wind direction with a different temperature of the day because it's a different time of the day. These are all the things we want people to heighten their awareness to. Responding to feedback, again, like we said earlier, total application and focus, which deliberate practice requires, and then the specificity of those goals. So the experts principles has a lot of overlap from the Aspire principles, but again, it still speaks to the difficulty of making sure of identifying where deliberate practice actually exists. From my own research, we've even shown how experts themselves, you'll see in the top graph there in A, that's when they're looking at when we give experts and lesser skilled athletes an opportunity to work on either a weak skill, a skill that they're weak at, or a skill that they're strong at. In the A slide there, you'll see the experts spend a significant amount of more time, and as a result of that, showed greater application and results from engaging in their weaker skill. Their stronger skill, they didn't put as much time and effort into. So there appears to be a hard wiring, if I may, it's not a great phrase, but for people who have those aspirations, they seem to be more akin to struggling, to being comfortable, being uncomfortable. They will spend the time on their weakness, where others will think, I'm going to spend time on my strengths. It's not to say that you don't spend time on your strength, but it's just that if it's a rate limiting factor, you might have to spend that time. So the resources available for deliberate practice, they're huge. They're everywhere, in fact. But here's a few key ones. On top of the ones that I showed earlier with Anders Ericsson, you'll notice also the first three for the eagle-eyed viewers. The first three on the left there are all the same name, but they're the three different editions of the same book. And the reason I mention them is not just because Nikki's on the call, but it's because unlike a lot of other first, second, third, or fourth editions of books, these books actually did develop from one edition to the next, which is a remarkable thing in itself. It takes a lot of work to do that, but each book, I would still encourage people to go back to the first book and go through the second book and go through the third book, because each has so much to offer, apart from all the other ones there as well. Okay, that's my 15 minutes of discussion, and back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you for that. I really love that use of language. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? I think they're questions we should ask ourselves a lot. So many thanks for that. Okay, so we're getting ready now to go into the first breakout rooms, and we have a couple of questions for you in the breakout rooms. I've just thrown them up in the chat box there. So first question really is, having heard from Dean and Ed, what do you think your percentage of your practice session or your practice week is dedicated to deliberate practice? And then also, what questions do you have for Dean or Ed? So when we come back from the breakout rooms, and that will be in around 10 minutes, we'll go through and just ask for maybe a few comments, and then that's where we can have our short question and answer session. So I believe we've got 4 rooms here, and I'm going to send you off to those rooms around now, and I look forward to seeing you back in around 10 minutes. Again, please nominate if you can, or voluntold someone if you can, that they are going to be the recorder of the notes, and then we would look for someone to be the person who would come back and give us the information that's been discussed. So I'll see you all in around 10 minutes.
I actually just need to grab my daughter quick.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, nap time.
Yeah.
Okay, so
we didn't nominate while we were in the breakout room. I was saying it just as we left, so I thought we'd try to finish it off here.
then Diane, we'll make you the nomination person for your room. You can just drop people in it.
All right.
Okay, so everyone's back in the room. Maybe if we go to room 1, which I think was Carrie, Dean, Harjeev, Julie, and Kevin. Wondered if you had some feedback and possibly questions for us.
Well, I took notes, so I guess I'll talk. we weren't quite sure. We were talking. We sort of got off on some other questions. So it seems that in our group, we didn't really discuss how many people are using technology. We had Dean in our group, so we asked him lots of questions, and he gave us lots of information. The issue of athlete access to technology and equity when you're sharing videos and using feedback came up. And also the time to engage in something like, deliberate practice became was a question, especially when you're talking about team sports or student athletes, was raised as an issue. And one of our participants mentioned that, just a statement, I guess, that deliberate practice is very hard to implement. Again, I think that depends partly on the sport that you're engaged in. Yeah, especially if you have team sports, of course, it would be very hard. And I asked Dean a question about his statement about highlights and having the athletes pick out highlights from the video. So I asked whether they were picking out positive highlights or negative highlights. And he said both, but that the athletes actually had to be encouraged to pick out the positive ones because they tend more to focus on what's not so good than what is good. So they have to be encouraged to do that. So I think that's the summary.
That's great. Thanks, Julie. I may have a question for you, Ed, at the end if no one else asked it. But if we can move on to room 2, which was Charles, Charlie, Diane, David, and Disa. So Diane, who's going under the bus?
Disa, would you be good to do the review, and then Dave, you can jump in with the question. Sound good?
What works for me?
Sure, let's do that.
Thanks.
So Charlie was in a unique situation because he's coming into his coaching environment basically at the last minute to get results. So he doesn't spend a lot of time doing this type of practice because his job is to get in there and get the athletes ready to win medals. So he definitely expressed a desire to work with developing athletes to use that type of practice, but he doesn't apply it in what he does. I'm on the flip side. I'm a more amateur coach, so I work with developing athletes, and I use this type of practicing more in my older athletes as we're fine-tuning things for big competitions, because it does take time and athletes need to understand all the components of what needs to be done. And that was our summary. So if you want to take it over with your question, David.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Disa. So the question that came up was prompted by Dean's comment about spending too much time scrummaging in practice relative to the amount of time that's spent scrummaging actually in a game, which raised a question about how do you actually come up with a principled way of identifying what you're going to practice and how much time you're going to spend practicing it. Because one approach obviously would be to sort of do a time motion analysis of the sport and say, this is how much time is actually spent in a game on this particular skill, this particular skill, this particular skill. And you might then say, okay, well, the skills that we perform the most, we're going to practice the most. But because you're performing a skill a lot, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the most important skill. A penalty shootout in soccer would be a classic example. I mean, how important is it to perform in a penalty shootout versus how many times do you actually have to do it in a game? It might be very, very rare, but it's an incredibly important skill. So how do you come up with this principled way of figuring out then what you're going to spend time on in practice, and how much time you're going to devote to each of the things you want to improve?
Yeah, great question. And I think, for me, it certainly, it varies quite a lot throughout the season. So for example, when we're going into a pre-season training camp, we probably spend quite a bit of time doing the additional things like, so for example, scrummaging, and I'll use scrummaging as an example. It's something that I, as a coach, value very, very highly, because if anybody knows anything about rugby, other than Dave, it's a platform to launch things from, and you want to be dominant in that area. So I want to make sure that in the early stage of the season, we've put a lot of work into that. And then as the season goes on, it's just topping things up, but also looking at the technology and saying, hey, in the last game, we had X numbers of scrums. We were quite dominant. We probably just need to fine tune it a little bit. Or we wasn't that good and we're coming up against another team that's a really good scrummaging. So we might change our focus. And I might say to the scrum coach, instead of, you're getting 15 minutes this week, you're going to get 35 minutes this week. So I can't really put a number to it, because it does keep changing depending on some of the circumstances that we're in. I guess, having said that, I have to balance everything, and we have our philosophy around where we want to play, and some things would take priority over others, because we've looked at our team profile and being able to say, we want to be known as a team that can do this, so we probably put a little bit more emphasis into that. But I don't, we really, the detail we get into around the planning is based around where are we right now, what more do we need to do, how does that work in the game, and as Ed said, there's only one way to find out what that's like, and that's up against the opposition. And then we have to review what's really important to us after that game, and then doing our preview of the opposition. Do we have to go up a little bit, or are we content with where we're at? So I hope I've answered your question there, but it does move up and down depending on time of year, circumstances, how we're performing in that area. And even if we're performing well, I must admit that if we're going really well, and I keep using the scrum as an example, we don't just say, hey, it's going really, really good, we're not going to focus on it. We actually probably get a little bit more excited by how good it is going, and just keep topping up and topping up, so it keeps getting better and better.
Thanks, Dean. And Diane, thanks for your leadership there in assigning those roles. Room 3, that's Brianne, Joe, Nikki, Suzanne, and Zach.
Yes, we chatted about the ratio and time spent on deliberate practices, and found it very much varied between what types of athletes we were coaching. So Suzanne, who coaches triathletes almost exclusively, is doing deliberate practicing, whereas Joe and myself, not so much doing team sports, unless we get more one-on-one time with individuals. And Zach also went on to talk about, I think especially more remotely with COVID and everything, using video and technology that way, and allowing athletes to video themselves and try to give themselves their own feedback and build athlete autonomy that way, rather than always being told what they should be doing or being an overbearing coach. I think that about summarizes our discussion.
Okay, thanks, Brianne. And then we'll go to room 4, which is Catherine, Corey, Christina, David, Ed, and Michael.
So I'll jump in here. We felt that the question about the percentage of practice that was deliberate was a bit of a trick question, because if there was a group, we talked about if there's a group of 12 people, how many of those people would actually be in deliberate practice? And if we had 6 out of 12, it would be absolutely outstanding. 1 or 2 are probably more likely. And people are probably going in and out of deliberate practice. It is quite individual. We also looked at you know, how specific the task that the people are doing, and how are they directed. And I have a question, Ed, about this. How much influence is it from the coach to put the athlete into deliberate practice, or how much of it is the athlete coming ready and prepared to do deliberate practice? So I'm sure it's an influence of either, but if you can talk about kind of the roles of either the athlete or the coach in putting someone into a state of deliberate practice.
Yeah, yeah, very good question. I'd probably, if I may speak to my own experience, I think, as I said, in 30 years coaching, the first 10 years of my coaching experience, I probably coached the way I was coached. So very much me deciding who was doing what and when they were going to do it, which is never a great place to be in. The second 10 years, I was in kind of turmoil as I was trying to figure out, you know, hearing about a much more cooperative way and thinking, oh, hang on, if I give up my position as a coach, then I'm not really coaching. Then finally realize actually that is coaching. It's less, as I say to people, it's not coaching anymore. It's actually more coaxing. So I think if I'm in a more coaxing type environment, then it very much is, I find it's far more coming from the athlete. If I can create that environment where they're curious about what they can do to get better, I think they're coming with remarkable questions about how they can get better, with very pointed questions, because even then when they look at some of the analysis of their performance, they're coming with very specific questions, which then quickly we together will co-create some practice tasks that oftentimes will get them right into a place of deliberate practice. And because these are oftentimes the tasks that they feel have caught them out in performance. So they're the things that they don't maybe like to work on that often. So you've ticked the not immediately rewarding, the not inherently enjoyable box. They are motivated. They are, you know, it takes a lot of effort, both cognitive and physical, and even, you know, even for tasks that are maybe not that physical. Because of the cognitive effort, they feel physically too. And I've often, I suppose to answer the question directly, I think ideally coming more from the athlete, if the coach can create that environment where they feel they have a voice and a place to come with those questions and challenges about what their practice should look like and do and feel like. But also then that the coach is ready to I suppose to co-create and to share in the process of trying to figure out what is the best way to tackle this. I'm constantly trying to encourage other coaches in Coach Ed to, you know, be less you know, to release the grip, you know, not the white knuckle ride of holding on to the athletes and what they do and when they do it and how they do it. And so I think, yeah, more ideally more coming from the athlete if the environment is set up for that.
Right, but the coach could also create an environment that stifles that as well.
100%. I like, as I said, the environment I probably created for years was a very stifling environment. Because I rarely looked for feedback in the early days because I was in the space of why should I look for feedback? I've written this session. I've written this program. It's perfect. Sure. Why would I ask for feedback? Because I wrote it. It's, you know, it's a pretty scary place to now. As I've said many times in the past, I've actually done this. I've reached out to athletes from back then and said, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry for what I did. I hope you can forgive me. But it's an appalling place to be in because it's not you know, they're not an extension of me. And my job is just to be in there to help them get to where they need to be and fulfill their potential, not my version of what their potential is.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corey. Let's go to Dean and then Diane, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to follow on a little bit from that, because I know, when you are coaching team sports, to get that deliberate practice in, as Ed's explained it, it's very, very difficult. And one thing that I did earlier on was I used to film. What we do is we give a 15-minute window of opportunity at the start of every session for the athletes to do what we call habit forming. And we put all the equipment out, and they can do what they want within the 15 minutes. And a couple of sessions, I just filmed it. I just let the camera run, and then at the start of the main part of the session, I'd say, "Hey, how did the habit forming go today?" "Oh, it was great. It was awesome. Loved it." I'm like, "Okay." So I did that for a couple of times, and then I showed them it, and they were like, "Oh my goodness. All we're doing here is forming bad habits on chattering and talking about things and catching up how school's going." So then we really changed our focus. And I was just saying, every 15 minutes, we're doing this habit forming, we're wasting time. So we then got into a system of, for a while, it was, okay, what are you going to do within that 15 minutes to make you better? And we had the coaches connect with smaller groups. So for example, if somebody wanted to work on being better in the tackle area, then that group would then go with the person who I appoint to look after the tackle. So at least we were getting a good 15 minutes then of quality work done. So it was a bit of a, let's let them go and see what happens. Now we review it. Now we bring it back in and say, this is how we're going to do it. So, and it's been very successful for us. Don't get me wrong. There's times where I just have to blow the whistle and say, "Hey, just have a look what's going on." And they're like, "Got it." And they're back on track again. So that's worked pretty well for us.
I think, if I may, I think that speaks to one of the conversations that came up in our group, where I spoke about, trade-off practice, where especially in team sports, because deliberate practice is tricky in a team sport. It almost doesn't exist, to be honest, if you're trying to do it in a group, because of the individual nature of it. So how do we create that individual nature of deliberate practice in a team session? And it's to have these trade-offs. I need to work on this. Will you give me some of your time, because you're actually a link player within what I do often in sport? Yeah, great. And I'll give that back to you at a session, or actually, I need, if I'm the goalkeeper and I need to practice some kickouts, or I'm the goaltender in hockey, I need to practice some puck outs and whatever, that I actually identify who are the people I'm most likely to do this to, where has it been identified in performance analysis that I've been poor at this. And then you do that trade-off. You actually engage people in, it's almost, we call there's been times we call it practice monopoly. I'm going to give you some 15, 20 minutes of my time, and then you're going to give me 15, 20 minutes of your time, because I need you for me to be able to do some of my work, let's say. But again, that feeds into that environment of, well, if actually we're all starting to help each other, well then, the whole thing rises up as we engage with each other in that kind of collaborative manner.
Diane, do you have a question?
Oh, it was actually back when Dave Anderson asked his question, but I just felt that what Dean was saying kind of gels so much with what Ed is saying, in terms of how you're kind of trying to identify these rate limiting factors. And I like the use of rate limiting factor, like what's the weakest link? What isn't allowing us to keep the ball, or what isn't allowing us to get a lot across the finish line faster than the next person, and so on. And in some ways, that's really where the coach comes in, right? Like, how is it that the coach engages with the athlete to really recognize the rate limiting factor, and how that recognition maybe then motivates them to become that athlete that you characterized, of being motivated, intentioned, patient, impatient, and so on. And it's not, I don't think it's just the athletes like that, because you use hardwired, and I kind of like, I don't think the athletes just like that. I do think that itself is a collaborative process, and it comes with the coach, I think, engaging in that analysis and identifying those rate limiting factors, that allow them then to buy in, whether that be as a team or as an individual athlete. So I just, yeah, I just wanted to sound off on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. Ed, we've got a question in the chat box from Julie. And so we'll do this question, then we'll go to Suze, I think, as a question, and then we'll move into our next presentations. So the question from Julie, Ed, is what percentage of practice for an individual athlete, and I'm assuming because Julie's karate, she's thinking about an individual athlete in an individual team sport, should be deliberate practice?
That's a great question, and I'm delighted it's in karate. In fact, as a karate player myself, I'm fascinated, in fact, by how karate is divided into kata patterns that very often bear no resemblance to what we actually do when we're in combat space. And I've been thinking that for many years. And even when my two boys started karate, I was like, they're all working very hard on being very perfect in their kata, and then when they go into combat and kumite, I think it's called, they get their heads kicked in because it happens to what happens in the organized practice. So I think, you know, what percentage of deliberate practice should be deliberate practice? I think in simple terms, it depends on the level that they're at. It depends on where they want to go to. I think I'd be very slow to be engaging young people in deliberate practice, depending on the sport, of course. If it's gymnastics and they're expected to peak at an earlier age. But other than that, I'd be very strongly following the kind of the recommendations for people like Joe Baker and Jean Cote about making sure that we plenty of sampling and plenty of diversification. The like. Later on, I think it needs to be ramped up, especially when we start seeing people transition out of junior into senior, and they will experience a step up in performance. They go from senior, especially we see the evidence again suggests that junior athletes, successful junior athletes, have an appalling strike rate when they go to senior space. Across a number of sports now, and a colleague of Phil Carney of mine, Phil Carney in University of Limerick has done some lovely work on this. So how can we help those junior athletes when they transition out of the junior space to better weather the storm when they go into the much larger pool of senior sport? And I think deliberate practice is a good place for that, because it will help them, it will make them that little bit more robust. On top of that, I think as they get better, I've seen the percentage go up, because then, for example, I'll give you a perfect example. One of the golfers I work with, he's now at a very elite level. So of course now almost everything he does is deliberate practice, because he's now trying to fine tune. He's now looking at those finest rate limiting factors. And just to go back to Diane's point, I did say that hardwired was an appalling term to use. It stuck in my own craw when I said it. But so I think as they progress, I think the percentage increases as they progress, because then we're trying to remove them from these positions and points of arrested development. And deliberate practice is pretty good at people shifting them up to another level. And that's why I think it's such a great conversation that we've been having today, because deliberate practice as an individual pursuit is something that is oftentimes ignored, for me, too much within the team sport space, because it's almost like, sure, we can't because it's team sport. I just think we can. Some kids are ready.
Thanks, Ed. Go to Suzanne for the last question, and then we'll move on.
Thanks. Less a question and more just a follow-up comment to Diane's comments. I really do agree that there's a relationship there, and that the coach does bring some things to that equation that the athlete doesn't know yet. And it's kind of getting, drawing that, using the feedback, using the deliberative approach as they get higher and higher performing, to be able to draw that out, and then to be able to find that place where their intrinsic motivation, along with the coach's kind of overview of what we need to do to get them there, then changes, I think, a little bit more substantially than it does in the age groupers or in the juniors, and in the developmental process, I guess, through the long-term development of an athlete.
Thanks for those comments, Suze. So what we'll do is, if we're just going to take a 5-minute break here, just a quick bio break for people. Just one thing, if I could ask, David, we're in the middle of the European Championships here in soccer, and if we can not mention penalties because England are preparing to get knocked out next Tuesday on penalties, then I'd be really happy if we could not talk about penalties again, please. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we're going to hear from Disa Fladmark. So I'll see everybody in 5 minutes, 12:25. Okay, so let's get moving with the second part here. So I'd like to introduce Disa Fladmark from BC Artistic Swimming. She's sports service coordinator with BC Artistic Swimming, but also a comp dev coach with Kamloops Sunrays. She deals with a lot of coordination around the sports services area in terms of competition. And she's got a unique insight into how technology has impacted a judge sport. It's great to say, along with Dean, Disa is also a graduate of the Advanced Coaching Diploma, and I had the pleasure to get an opportunity to go see her coach, and was impressed with her ability to see through 12 feet of water when sometimes I can't see 5 feet in front of myself. So I do appreciate that ability. So I'll stop sharing, Disa, and ask you to share your screen, and look forward to what you have to say to us.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I just want to start out saying that I'm definitely humbled to be among some of the experts in sport in the world. And so I hope that I can provide a unique insight into kind of the more grassroots, a more amateur level involvement in sport. And I don't have access to a lot of technology, and I think I'm a pretty good representation of what artistic swimming clubs do in our province. So as Andrew mentioned, I am the sport services coordinator with BC Artistic Swimming, and my main job over the past year has been coordinating online competitions, which has been quite a challenge, and then also working as a coach for national stream and provincial stream athletes. Throughout the past season, we've had a lot of positives. As I mentioned, we were able to hold all of our competitions through virtual means. This meant that a lot of the geographic restrictions for participation in our province was removed. So those that needed to travel from Prince George or Nelson, all of a sudden the smaller competitions were more feasible in terms of travel, but also in terms of financial barriers, not having to buy plane tickets, ferry tickets, hotel rooms, etc. We were also able to remove the technological barriers in our province. BCAS, BC Artistic Swimming, has iPads and tripods for all of our clubs to use. So in that aspect, it was removed. And also we had some tech support, which was me guiding coaches on how to navigate through some of the technology. We were able to get our national stream athletes qualified for and competing at national competitions. And another positive was that everyone became more computer savvy. So this included staff, coaches, athletes, and particularly our officials. So all of a sudden, the world opened up to us. So it wasn't just an official coming to our pool deck to give feedback. It was anybody in the province, in the country, in the world. All of a sudden, we could get feedback from top level coaches and officials that we normally wouldn't have access to. And as another note, our competition calendar was only slightly modified, which was fantastic. Challenges, particularly for our sport, was 3-meter social distancing. And I know this is a challenge for a lot of sports, but for us, our goal is to swim as close together as possible. So training 3 meters apart from each other was a complete mind shift. And we'll see later how that affected how the judges were able to judge our sport. As in other sports, pylons, flags, and markers were required to be used, and they needed to be visible during competitions, or else you could risk being disqualified from your competition. We had a lot of changes to pool access, which included only being able to swim on the spot. For instance, in this picture, not being able to swim in lengths, being in shallow ends, or just having limited access to pools because of needing to change over between user groups. For me, using videos this year was particularly important because I was the only coach on deck. So I was responsible for running the programs for 4 different age groups at once. So that I relied heavily on the iPad so that athletes could self-video. And as we talked about it last week, using this type of feedback does come with drawbacks because athletes need to understand how to use the technology, how to interpret the videos, so that when they're looking at the video after, they can extract the next steps themselves without necessarily having guidance from me. So that is a learning process that we did need to go through. Coaches were also now required to film high quality videos for competition submission. So we had to become videographers, and this meant more time recording videos at practices as test runs, more time downloading and modifying the sound levels on routines, downloading, uploading videos, etc. And for me, the video submissions were the most stressful part of the season. Trying to get everything right so that the athletes are not disqualified was very, very stressful. And so all of these limitations changed the face of artistic swimming in BC. And here's one example of how we adapted our judging. So you'll see on the left-hand side there, we have our solo event with panel 1 and panel 2, and then we have our duet, team, and combo events with 3 panels. I know we have another artistic swimming coach on this discussion today, so she'll probably be the only one that knows that we are missing a huge chunk of our sport on these panels, which is the artistic impression. Artistic impression includes choreography, manner of presentation, and music interpretation, which normally accounts for 30 to 40% of our scores. But because we did video submissions, athletes needed to wear goggles. They needed to be 3 meters apart. The judges simply did not feel that they could fairly judge this component. Additionally, we knew that athletes did not have the physical space to move around the pool like they normally would. So pool patterns, pattern changes within a routine, all highlights and all joined components were completely removed from artistic swimming in our province. So you can see that this placed heavier emphasis on the execution, synchronization, and difficulty panels, which were all reweighted. And so if thinking about how this would affect your training plan to have a huge component of your training removed, I'm not necessarily saying that you didn't want to continue to build on that, but it wasn't going to be judged. So that was something that a decision was made to make things a bit easier for people in the province, but it also required a huge adaptation. We're going to move on to an example of how I used video to help my athletes throughout the season. So this video is my junior level athlete, Kira. She's 16. In her routine, she's required to do 5 elements. Each are scored independently. And this is a quick element of her second, quick video of her second element, the split spin. And this is for her national qualifier submission that was filmed on March 17th. So if you're not an expert in artistic swimming, take a look at her feet, and we want to see a smooth movement and no wobbling. Okay, so that was her submission for qualifiers, and this is the judge feedback that we received. So we can see an element 2, it's weighted at a 2.5. She received a score from 6.2 to 6.5. So we decided through collaboration and through receiving different types of feedback that we would set new goals for the national meet. So a type of feedback that we got was the scores from the judges. We also received written feedback from particular judges. We did a video review of her performance, and we did a video review of athletes who received first, second, and third place in that particular element. A great thing again about having the online meets is that Canada Artistic Swimming had all of the videos up on their website, so we could go back and review all the swimmers across the country if we wanted to look at what other athletes are doing that we're not doing to get those higher scores. Then we can see here on the right-hand side that Kira set some specific goals for herself to achieve what the judges had said we need to work on. And then from there, we built a routine of specific drills to address each of these goals. So we do a bunch of drills, decide which ones we felt are most effective, put them all together into an hour-long routine, and she would do that each practice. And then we would use the video review. And the way that we would do it is she would swim her routine or the element. She would come back to the wall and we would say, how would you rank yourself on each of your elements based on your goals? And she would give herself a number for each of them. And then she would review the video and we would decide if there was anything that she wanted to add to that feedback based on what she saw. And then we would repeat this. We keep track of her score to see which elements were improving and which weren't. And that if we needed to shift our focus in the plan or create some new drills or just try something different. Throughout all of this process, we were continuing to gather feedback from experts. So here she is a month later, again, looking at feet to see, you know, she's having extra movements. So I don't know if you guys can notice, but she was definitely more stable at the end of the element than last time. Here I am giving immediate feedback, which the yelling after as soon as she was done. And then here she is again using the same practice technique for her performance at the national championships. Okay, and then this is the judges' feedback that we received from that competition. So again, the score range was from 7.0 to 7.2, and she did improve in all of her elements listed on the side there. So we were very happy with the results that she was able to achieve. And the lessons that we learned through all of this, and including the pandemic and using all the technology, was that we can learn new things. And this is as a collective within our sport and our province. We get a little bit stuck in our ways, but this past year, we definitely showed that we can learn new things and we can adapt. And that these challenges that we ran into actually made us stronger because we were able to come together more as a community. And that using feedback from various sources, so collecting it from the judges, their scores, their feedback, other coaches throughout the country and the world, referring to your FINA manual and modeling, using all those things together to create your training plan can have significant results. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Disa. That's a great insight to some of those challenges that you've been facing. As Diane says, lots of silver linings during the situation that we found ourselves in. So thank you very much for that. So our last presentation today is from Dr. Nicola Hodges from the University of British Columbia. Nikki runs the Motor Skills Lab and Kinesiology at UBC. And she's also involved in a number of projects related to skill development. I know that she's been working on a number of projects in soccer, so that I think that's great for soccer. She's also involved in studying action prediction processes and the mechanics of making accurate predictions based on the different types of training that you're able to develop. So I'll stop sharing here, and I'll hand over to Nikki.
Sorry, just trying to unmute there. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, and you can see fine. Okay, well, wonderful. So thank you for hanging in there for the last presentation of this workshop. And thank you, Andrew and David, for putting this together, and for the speakers. It's so wonderful to have the coaches and the researchers come together and just listen and then have some discussion. So I'm going to try and stick to 15 minutes. I think I might be slightly over. So Andrew, you can cut me off if I start waffling, because so much has been raised today and yesterday that I just want to talk to it in this presentation, but I will try not to get too distracted. Okay, we'll kind of go forward here. Sorry, let me. Okay. So just very briefly, I am an academic. I spend a lot of time in my lab. My undergrad actually is in psychology. So I basically use experimental psychology a lot of the time to study anything to do with practice. I've done a little bit of consultancy work and worked in community organizations to figure out how we can apply some of the stuff that we do in the lab more broadly. And I think I'm slowly getting more involved in some of the outreach. And for many years, myself and my students are always sort of tasked with these problems about how can we study practice. What's a good vehicle to study practice? So we often use different sports as a task or a vehicle to answer really general questions about mechanisms of learning and mechanisms of practice. So today I'm going to talk to you a quite sort of high level general principle about a challenge point framework, which has been proposed as a sort of meta model of motor learning. And I sort of adapted my title to speak a bit to what Disa has been chatting about, which is adapting to challenge, but also this importance of using challenges to adapt. And I maybe am not going to tell you anything new here. I think what Ed has discussed, what Dean has discussed, even the discussions from last week, there is this appreciation that we need to get out of our comfort zones. I think even Disa mentioned this, whether this is technology or whether this is an athlete, that for learning to occur, you need to shake it up a bit. So I'm going to talk to you about the challenge point framework, but I'm also going to talk about perhaps sort of some higher level goals that make the challenge point framework a little bit more applicable to coaching, to applied coaching. So the way to think about some of these goals is to sort of ask a couple of questions about practice design. The first one is, of course, how can we keep athletes improving, which is particularly important for high-level athletes, adapting technology changes, as Disa has nicely illustrated, and facilitate these transitions to the next level. I would call this the train to learn issue, or even a goal. The second is this relationship between what an athlete does in practice and its transferability to competition and match play. This is something that's resonated in all the talks and the questions. I would call this the train to transfer challenge aspect. And there may be subtle differences depending on what the goals are of how practice is designed, whether it's a learning goal or a transfer goal, where you really want to maximize transfer to competition. And the final piece is how can we best balance engagement or athlete confidence and effort to optimize the practice session. So challenging practice is effortful. Deliberate practice requires concentration, and so it's probably limited in its engagement. So I think this train to maintain or reinforce is also very important, this strengthening of skills as a goal of practice and also a consideration. So we might want to think of these as the LTM goals of the challenge framework, where I think it's important to be considerate of whether this is about training to learn and improve. Is this practice really about, I've got a game coming up and I need people to perform well tomorrow or in the next week to win the medal? Or are we really working on this strengthening confidence, key skills, and maintenance practice? Of course, there's overlap here, a lot of overlap, but I think it's also relevant to how the design of practice may proceed. So let's talk a bit about train to learn first. This is really what has been discussed in the challenge point framework about optimizing challenge and finding the zone of practice, finding the zone of practice which is most likely to promote learning. What's fundamental to this is that what we see in practice is not a valid measure of the amount of quality of learning. Or stated another way, what we see at time point now is not necessarily a good measure of what we will see at a later time. And I know many of you have spoken about this idea of getting multiple measurements or even monthly summaries. I think Dean mentioned that if we want to look at learning, we can't rely on a short-term assessments. And this has been illustrated in motor learning research for a long time, that the conditions which are where we see performers performing well, maybe not making errors, that's not where learning is happening. And so these, let's call them relatively easier or low challenge conditions, are an important part of practice, but that doesn't mean that this is what individuals are learning when we see them at another time point. And this has been illustrated in motor learning research by the contextual interference effect. You don't really have to understand this, but one of the illustrations of this is that if you engage individuals in more variations of practice, so they're constantly switching between different skills, it's a highly cognitively engaging practice. And I've illustrated this in the graph as difficult practice. Then you see worse performance, so poorer performance is higher on the y-axis and good is lower. Then you see poorer performance in practice, but when you test at a later date, there's more remembering going on from this more effortful practice in comparison to easier conditions where you're repetitively doing the same thing. And one of the things that happens is when individuals are repetitively doing the same thing, there is this sense of learning, which is, this interesting counterpoint to allowing individuals to control their own practice. You give too much autonomy, then individuals need some constraints on that, because there may be this sense of fluidity from repeating the same thing over and over again. Oh, I'm getting better, but that ease is not a good signal for learning. So there has to be some maybe intervention from a coach or appreciation that errors are an important learning signal. So one of the ways this has been illustrated is as this optimal challenge point, or what we've referred to, myself and Keith Lose in a recent paper, as an optimal challenge zone, where on the y-axis here you have functional difficulty. This just basically means challenge, but it's in reference to the individual. So it's like a relative difficulty. It depends on the athlete that you're looking at, and of course the skill that you're looking at. So a very skilled athlete, their low difficulty will be very different to a novice athlete. Very simply, we've got performance on one of the axes here, in the green dashed line, and then learning on the other y-axis. So If difficulty or challenge is low, of course, performance should be good. Like you shouldn't be performing without much error. You're doing something that you have already mastered. But of course, for learning to occur, which is the black solid line, there's no learning occurring, or very little learning occurring, if performance is stable or there are no errors. We need to create situations where there's room for new information in the environment and the athlete needs to want it. So there has to be some violation of their expectations. I expected this to happen, this did happen. Okay, I don't really need to pay attention because everything else is gelling quite nicely. The idea of this optimal challenge point is shifting or adapting to a level where there is some now variability, some uncertainty in the environment. And this could be through the execution of the action, or it could be through delivery of information as well. Like, let's get some new information in here if we want to get change. And if we want to get change, that's how we get improvement, obviously. Of course, this can be contrasted to situations, so this is the zone, where we could be in a comfortable zone of performance where there's low functional difficulty. That may be important, and I'll come back to this. But if there's too much information, too much complexity, again, depending on the individual, then this is what we'd call a sort of this punishing zone. So it's really about finding this sweet spot and this optimal zone of functioning. So just trying to give very quickly an applied example here, and drawing on some of the examples from last week as well. Really, the train to learn is about introducing new information to the athlete, to the environment, to the situation that they're in, on an individual level or a team level. And obviously from some of these discussions, it's resource heavy probably, and requires consideration of the weaknesses and how much time you have to spend on an individual. This may be something like play in a new position. So if you're trying to work on, for example, as a blocker, on the timing or at picking up the key cues in volleyball, there is the possibility of actually letting the volleyball player play as a setter in some situations. There's new information to be gained from that action, and there's at least research evidence, we're working on some, but from other domains suggests that sort of action experience may facilitate the perception as well. Or even just showing different viewpoints. If even though you're used to seeing the blocker view, actually getting the first person viewpoint from the setter introduces new information. And then there would have to be some measurement about what you want to change there, assuming that's what you're going for. And last week, in the great talk from Kevin on sailing and integrating GPS with the video side by side, which has been mentioned again today. There's new information that's being provided to the learner, perhaps about the accelerations during the tacking. And I suppose the idea is that there's a weakness, maybe this part of the action is slow. I'm going to bring in some new information into the environment, and then there has to be some measurement, right, to make sure that what you think you're changing, that new information is actually now being used. And maybe there needs to be a room to allow errors to be made. This is the really key part, I think, of the challenge framework, is and even in the coaching framework, is that it has to be permissible now for learning to take place. I might be recording all your performance sessions, but if this is a practice designed to improve performance, it's okay to make errors, to be variable, to muck up sometime, because that's the zone for learning. And I think the understanding from the coach and the athlete that I'm not judging you now is really critical. I want to talk briefly about these other two goals, the train to transfer and the train to maintain. Often when we think about learning, we cannot ignore the role of the environment that we want to transfer to. So sometimes learning and transfer are used interchangeably. But I think in a sports setting, there's another layer here in terms of the goal, that if you want to maximize transfer to the game competition, then you have to consider what that competition is going to look like as well. And this may, in some situations, put learning goals differently to transfer goals. I think the example that was given of the scrum, and then some discussion about that afterwards, I think if the goal is training to learn, the amount of time that you might spend on that action may be very different than if the goal is training to transfer, for instance, where you've got a game coming up and you're not expecting to spend much time perhaps on that scrum. But the specificity of challenges relate to, these challenges could be physical, psychological, knowing the team that you're playing against. And it's really about simulating, at least in parts of practice, those specific game demands. So here we could illustrate this very simply as this sort of one-on-one relationship between the challenges in practice and the challenges expected in competition, which is really this optimal challenge for transfer. The greater match between what you're doing in practice to competition, and you would expect most of the time that this would be relatively high, then the more likely you are to get optimal transfer. And again, just to think of some examples here, there's been some really quite interesting work at the University of Bangor on consequential practice, where to simulate the anxiety perhaps of performing under competition pressure, and this is some work with Lou Hardy and Stuart Beattie in cricket, that they bring in error-based consequential practice into the practice environment, where for a portion of practice, if you make an error, the whole team pays a consequence. And this is decided on before, there's an agreement, it is like a punishment, but it's meant to simulate actually what happens on game day. You know, if somebody makes an unforced error, the rest of the team now has to work doubly hard to sort of get that back. And you could also do this on an individual level as well. But it could be more simple things like even just bringing crowd noise into practice. When I had the opportunity to work with the women's soccer team at BC Place Stadium, on one of their practices, they actually used crowd noise. And one of the things that they found out is like, oh gosh, look, now we can't communicate because it's so loud. You know, but this is a really good way of also trying to induce the excitement and the anxiety, which may impact decision making. So if your attention is being distracted by noise or being used up by other things going on, your heart rate is faster, then practicing under those conditions or when you're fatigued makes a lot of sense. And finally, just in terms of train to maintain, and this is nothing new, of course, the coaches out there, but the challenges need to be individually suited. And there's really that important aspect of reinforcing key skills for confidence, but also maybe for automaticity, that we want maybe some degree of overlearning so that certain aspects of skills do not require as much attention as others. For example, dribbling in many different sports, because you need to have your focus on decisions. So really, this is maybe more in that comfort zone of functional difficulty. It's still a high level skill depending on the athlete, but now you might want to change the way you practice to try and reinforce these strengths. And this is going to be really important coming up to an important competition. This is not where you're engaging in train to learn. So again, just some examples. This could be, people do this all the time, where maybe overloading the attackers versus the defenders, you're creating more opportunities for the attackers to score. And if scoring is, the thing that wins you the games, then before a game, let's reinforce those strengths. Maybe move the goals in even closer. There's more opportunities to score. And Diane nicely talked about video feedback last week, where not only might you be creating videos that show your best attempts, but you can also create videos that are spliced together to make it look like it's your best attempt, but it's really bits and pieces of different attempts so that it's really sort of reinforcing this good idea. So this is just a summary graphic. I'm going to finish up here, Andrew, and I realize I might have gone over a bit here. But the two key things are difficulties and specificity, challenges and specificity to competition. So we've got specificity on the x-axis here, and anything to the left in that red is probably not very good, right? So at this very low corner here, where low challenges, low specificity, this is just probably poorly conceived drills. You know, it doesn't look like the competition and it doesn't have much challenge. It might be fun, but it's not going to help much. And if we move up a little bit on the challenge scale, we might have something that's more challenging, but if it doesn't look very much like the game or aspects of it, you might be learning, but you know, is it going to have any transfer? And then to the right of this is where we're really getting into these zones for learning and transfer and maintenance practice. So I know I've gone over. I don't need to plug my book because Ed has done a really good job of that. I will plug some studies going on in the lab if anybody wants to share or participate. We're looking for coaches, we're looking for athletes, and you can just send me an email or reach out to these wonderful students and look on our website. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. So question for the breakout rooms, just going to throw in the chat box there, is what strategies do you use in your own sport to shift athletes from a zone of performance comfort to one of learning? And how do you assess this? So I'm going to open the breakout rooms here. And we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Again, if we're looking for someone to come back and report, and I will look forward to seeing you in 10 minutes. Okay, so everybody's back. So let's maybe see if we can let's maybe go in reverse order here, keep people on the toes. So if we look at room 4, that was Corey, Christina and Ed. Just wondered if you had some comments around how you move your athletes from this zone of performance into one of learning.
So I don't know if we actually answered that question very much. We spent a lot of time talking about pole vault, which of course I'm always happy to do. We talked a lot about how just because it's such a sequential event that you have to look at like what's each individual athlete is going to have something different going wrong in their jump, and you always have to focus on fixing the first thing going wrong in the chain before you move to something else. So just by nature, you have to have different athletes working on different things at every single practice, because like if somebody can't run, they're not going to be able to vault properly. If their takeoff is the first thing that's going wrong, you have to fix that before you fix anything else. And kind of like gymnastics, which is where I started, just by the nature of the event, you have to have everybody doing their own things. I don't know how much I actually analyze how well those deliberate practices and learning zones are happening, but yeah, I don't know if I missed anything.
Okay, Nikki, I wondered if you might have any thoughts about pole vaulting, which is such a sequential, sport. You've got to run before you jump, and you got to get over the hoop, or sorry, the bar, and then you've got to land.
The only one comment I'll make, I think, is perhaps that sometimes that separation between learning and transfer in terms of goals, that there is a place in practice for breaking skills down, for part practice, for maybe even repetition and block practice. If the goals, if the goals are learning and you need to change something, then it doesn't have to look exactly like the final product. I think sometimes that gets missed in some of the conversations in skill acquisition at the moment about how important that game environment is. because there is a need, and it sounds like pole vault is one of those exemplars where, and gymnastic routines as well, where there are certain skills that are not temporarily highly related, like you can actually break them down into their components, and although there is some dependencies, they can be separated, and there's a lot of research to support doing kind of that part practice on those type skills. And you know, the whole idea of identifying weaknesses, you know, which part is it? Okay, let's work on it. Of course, you're going to have to put it back together again, but that's not where you would necessarily start from.
Okay, thanks, Nikki and Christina. Sorry for calling the bar a hoop. Don't know what I was thinking about. Okay, so let's go to room 3, which was Brianne, Joe, Nikki, and Zach. Any comments in the room there? That was a heavy UBC room there, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think Susan and I talked most just because Joe and Zach were with Nikki. Can anyone actually recap what Susan said? Because I did miss part of that.
Okay, was Suzanne in your room?
Yeah, she was. Yeah. She just spoke about really the importance. Correct me if I'm wrong, Zach or Nikki, but the importance of education in coaching athletes and making them, you know, explaining the why, explaining the how, really educating them on the training process, so that number one, they're involved in that, invested in that, and that they have a good, solid understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. So rather than, hey, let's just get better today, it's also about, hey, let's learn how we're getting better, why we're doing the things we're doing so that we can get better. I think, and she was just tying that into her coaching philosophy, which I think we all identified with.
Thanks, Joe. And if we can go to room 2, which was Charles, David, Diane, and Disa.
Once again, we didn't nominate, so I'll just throw myself under the bus here. And the opening part of the discussion was Dave and I speaking to the fact that we're really impressed with the chat comments and some of the feedback from the coaches, that they get it, that, you know, what you see on the day of performance when you're introducing something does not necessarily mean that they've learned something. And we were saying, as teachers, and we really try to educate, get that point across. It's such a central component. So we were impressed with how that was being embraced by community here. So that was great. And then I'll speak to Charles a little bit, spoke to the fact that to kind of transition them, what he does is he might change the equipment in some way so that something that is typically going well might not go so well. So he's skeleton, so he might change, and he can jump in if he wants, but something to do with the blades or some of the resistance that might happen, and how that really forces the athlete to kind of reconnect and think about it. And Disa worked with the similar kind of ideas about, she may introduce some mishaps, and that just makes the athlete kind of really think about some stuff again. So, you know, all of a sudden the music turns off and the athlete should continue with their performance, and how does that disrupt them, and how does that become a moment to kind of work with them on them taking that in and using it to modify how they're moving forward. So I think those were the main points of our conversation.
Can I add one thing?
Go for it,
Diane. So this just really stood out for me. Charlie had said that they're very focused on time as an index of performance in the skeleton. And so management, upper level people just want to see the times get faster. And so that raises a really interesting point about what metric we use to measure performance and learning. And often the metrics we use are outcome related things, but they're not necessarily the best measures of learning, because learning is often seen at lots of other levels of analysis. So if we're thinking about technique, for example, if we see a major change in technique that we know is ultimately going to help the athlete down the line, that's a really positive change. But but it's not necessarily going to be reflected in the outcome at the time, something like time. And so I just wanted to raise that as an issue we need to be cognizant of. You know, the metrics that we're using to gauge performance and learning need to be really looked at carefully when we're thinking about this distinction between performance and learning.
Thanks, David. Christina, Zach had a question for you in the chat box around do the vaulters sometimes run while holding the pole on the other side of the body during practice?
Absolutely not. There's one, you vault, right-handed people vault with their right hand as their top hand and their left foot as their takeoff foot. Left-handed people do it the exact opposite, and it's just, it doesn't work the other way. You can't, it doesn't work to hold the pole the other way, and it doesn't work to go up on the wrong side of the pole. You just get tangled, and that's how you get hurt. So it's one-sided only.
Okay, thanks, Christina. And then we'll just finally go to room one, which was Carrie, Dean, and Julie.
All right, I'll be sharing for our group. So we started by talking about how to keep athletes motivated while adding challenge to make sure they don't get kind of demoralized in that training, and how we need to make considerations for more expert versus more novice athletes, how some might be able to handle more of that challenge while others we might need to kind of talk out of that negative self-talk stage. And then Dean emphasized creating a safe environment for the athletes where they feel comfortable failing. One tool he brought up was having he called it a menu board in the change room, where athletes could put a sticky note on the board to say kind of if they were demotivated, if they were challenging, if they felt like they had opportunities in the practice, and that being a way to let the athletes share how they were feeling, and kind of be more engaged in that part. And then also when introducing more challenging activities, still going back and using some of that video feedback to show athletes what they looked like when they were doing it well as well, to keep up that motivation.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Carrie. Any questions? Any more questions or comments? So, Dean.
And it's sorry, I was on mute there. I got a bit of a question, and it maybe is, I don't know. Nikki might want to answer it, but you know, for me, and we're all trying to develop, and we're all trying to move forward, and we're all playing about with things, and you know, the environment for me creates so much of what we do. And as I mentioned in our group, we talk about a safe environment, and you know, coaches will say, "Oh, it's a safe environment." What does that actually mean to that athlete who stood there in front of the coaching staff and maybe 60 other 5 girls? So how important do you feel that creating that environment is so important? Because if you don't have that environment, what is the knock-on effect to people being comfortable with failure? We run a lot of sessions which are absolutely chaotic, to a point where I'm just like at times, what the hell's going on? And I just let it go, because I know that the failing, the challenging, but at the end of it, I just say, hey, that's okay. It's pretty good. And try then just to rewind it and step it up again. So I just wonder, you know, what you guys, and maybe, you know, Ed as well, how much emphasis do you think coaches should be putting on that environment?
I couldn't agree more. I think the way you describe it, that whole idea of, I know we use the word failure or making errors. Maybe it's just not performing as well as you can. Perhaps it's the nicer way of saying it. But that creating an environment where it's known and honored that this is a safe space for learning and development, I think is probably really key. And I don't know the best way of doing that, but I do know that the athlete has to appreciate the difference between performance and learning. And when they're being assessed based on performance, and when they're not necessarily being assessed, or they are, but they're being assessed based on their learning, their activities designed to try something new or different. And they need to be rewarded for those activities to try something new and different, rather than whatever that performance goal might be. But as to methods, that's maybe more your wheelhouse.
Thanks, Nikki. I think Joe, we'll go to Joe, and then we'll go to David, and maybe David, we'll let you wrap up for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in, Dean. I think that's a great observation on your end, because in my limited experience working with some smaller groups and trying to create this environment, I would say that it is the most important thing out of anything. When I've had some individuals and we're trying to engage in deliberate practice and I'm pushing them that envelope we're speaking of, whenever I've made it exceptionally clear that I am not going to change the way I react, coach you, or how happy I am with this session, whether if you're making mistakes, it's almost like a sense of relief. I'll never forget the first time I did that. This one particular athlete, a lot of the times athletes are making mistakes because of the anxiety anyways. And when I just said, hey, I want to push you, and I'm going to be okay with some mistakes, his face just completely changed. And I'll never forget that, because that was a key learning moment for me, that if we're not being very clear about what we expect from them or being okay with those errors, they're not going to be comfortable making them. And I remember there were athletes running around the pitch, cooling down, and some of them were shouting at him, whatever. And I just said, hey, dude, this is completely fine, and don't worry about them. And again, it almost it washed away the anxiety. So if you can create that, I think that'd be the number one thing to do.
Yeah, I do a bit of work as a coach developer, and I sometimes go and watch a session and evaluate it, and I walk away from it saying, well, okay, it looked pretty, it looked really good, but actually how much development went on, how much learning, how much challenging. And when I ask the coach, hey, how did it go? What do you think? It's all great, it's wonderful. But I'm just like, is that what we're doing every single day when we're running a practice? So, yeah.
Okay, let's go to David.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, maybe this does help wrap it up, that I always stress to my students that one of the central paradoxes of learning they have to deal with is that we learn from our mistakes, but we're motivated by our success. And as a coach, more or less, that's what you got to wrestle with, is coming up with the right balance between success and failure. And I think this is where individual differences become really important, because that balance between how much failure you can tolerate and how much success you need is going to vary from athlete to athlete, and it's going to vary from stage of practice to stage of practice. But I think it is the central challenge for the coach in this realm, is figuring out that balance. And it may also vary from week to week, in addition to characteristics related to athletes and so on. So that's how I kind of like to synthesize this problem that we wrestle with here.
David, thank you for that. And I think that's a great place for us to end. I'd like to thank Dean, Ed, Disa, and Nikki for the presentations today. Again, great stuff. As last week, it's fantastic to see people speaking about something that they love. You can tell immediately that comes through. So just great conversation. I would like to ask people to maybe have some time to think about some takeaways from this, and please email those to me, because I'd like to maybe collect some of those things and be able to share that with the group. And I will be making sure we get this edited and up onto our website, and I'll send you an email when those things are ready to view. So again, thanks a lot, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see all of you soon, sometime in the future. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.